chairs, little figures used for playing games are cut in the stone benches. At 9 was the outer parlour, where a porter sat who kept the cloister door, and here merchants could come to sell their wares, or monks receive visits from their relatives after the chapter. This is perhaps a convenient place to state that our plan must not be taken as being an exact copy of any particular monastery. The Benedictines generally built on somewhat similar lines, but the positions of the various parts were often varied to suit local requirements. Thus, at Westminster Abbey, the outer parlour was at the west end of the south cloister walk. At 10 was the slype or passageway leading to the scriptorium or place where the monks wrote their manuscripts. In these days, before printing, all the church service books were made by hand and beautifully illuminated, and there must have been much letter writing as well to carry on the business of the convent. So it was done in these little rooms, each of which had a window to the north and a door opposite, opening onto the north walk of the smaller cloister at 11. At 12 was the chapter house or parliament of the convent. At 13 was the parlour or place where the monks could talk, and generally there were stairs up from here to the monks' dormitory above. This latter was a long upper chamber, which connected as well with the south transept of the church, so that the monks could easily go there for their services during the night. At 14 were various stores and cellars. At 15 were lavatories in 2 stories, the upper communicating by a bridge with the south end of the monks' dormitory for use at night. At 16 was the warming room, where the monks could warm themselves after service in the church on a cold winter's day, and in those days churches were not heated. The Romans had been able to do it very well indeed here in England 7 or 8 centuries before, but the manner of doing it had long since been forgotten. At 17 was the refectory, where they all fed, and near the door to the south walk of the cloister there was always a place where the monks could wash their hands, with, close by, days to be taught in the shadow of that glorious abbey and feed in an abbot's hall. An idea of the size of the old monasteries may be gained by giving the dimensions of some of the parts. At Westminster, the dormitory was 170 feet long, and the refectory was 130 feet long by 38 feet wide. The kitchen at Canterbury was 45 feet square, and at Worcester 35 feet. The guest hall at Canterbury was 150 feet long by 40 feet wide, so it can be seen that they could accommodate plenty of visitors. Now for the constitution of the convent. At the head came the abbot, then the prior, who was his chief assistant. There was a sub-prior and the monks. The chantor, or precentor, acted as singer and librarian. The sacristan took care of the church and the buildings. The cellarer was the steward who controlled all the business side. The hospitaller looked after the guests, and the infirmary the sink, while the almoner distributed the alms. The master of the novices was responsible for their education. The monk's day started at midnight, and the new day was ushered in with prayer. This first service was called matins. The this was finished, the junior monks and novices played games in the garden, and the elders slept for an hour. During the afternoon the monks worked, and it will be remembered that Saint Benedict, when he founded the order in the 6th century, expressly arranged that his monks should do manual labour, and thus keep their bodies healthy and strong. They were great gardeners, growing vegetables and medicinal herbs. Vespers were at 5 o'clock in the winter and 6 in the summer, and then supper followed. After came collations and reading in the chapter house, followed by a short interval in the cloister in the summer and the warming house in the winter. At 7 in the winter and 8 in the summer came compline, and half an hour later all would be in bed until they were roused again at midnight for matins. This was the way the old monks passed their days. It was a very peaceful and well-ordered existence, and there is little wonder that it attracted the studious man. The popular idea of the monk is that he was a fat man in a frock who either fished or ate large dinners, and the real work that he did is sometimes lost sight of. Sheltered by the cloister and protected by their vocation, they were able, in a rough and tumble age, while the barons spent their time fighting or hunting, to build up all the influences which were to civilise England. The nunneries for women were conducted on much the same lines. There is an interesting account in Jocelyn of Brakeland's Chronicle of how the monks elected an abbot, and were helped to do so by King Henry II. Jocelyn entered St. Edmundsbury in 1174, and the abbot there was Hugo, who was a very old man. The convent under his rule had got badly into debt. The Jews who had lent him money charged enormous interest, and poor Abbot Hugo was distracted. He went on pilgrimage to Canterbury in 1180, but being thrown from his mule near Rochester, dislocated his knee and died as a result of the fever caused by the bruises, and sad to relate, his servants plundered his apartments as soon as he was dead. The king placed an inspector over the monastery, and meanwhile collected the revenues, and it was not until 1182 that they could set about electing a new abbot. 6 of the elders selected the names of 3 of their own monks whom they considered suitable, writing them down in a document which was sealed, and then the prior and 12 monks set off with it to see the king at Waltham. They walked there, their frock skirts looped over elbow. Thereupon the king called on them to nominate 3, and this being already done, the seal was broken, and the names found to be Samson, the sub-sacristan, Roger, the cellarer, and Hugo, the 3rd prior. The king called for 3 other names, whereupon the prior was named as one, the sacristan as the 2nd, and Dennis, apparently a monk, the 3rd. With these nominations, the king asked for 3 from other convents. this discourse brought Samson in, and Samson it was who was elected and returned as abbot to the monastery he left as sub-sacristan. This means that he ranked as a peer, was lord of the manor, and had 50 knights under him. For 4 years, Samson had hard work paying off the Jews, and this done, they were marched over the borders and bid never return. The principal monastic order was that founded by Saint Benedict in AD 529. To the 3 vows of obedience, poverty, and chastity has spoken of the various religious orders, and more especially of the monastery, and of the life that was led within its walls, it may be as well to try and understand something of the part these orders played in developing the architecture of the time, and here we shall find that their influence was very great indeed. Figure 15, which is here, shows the aisle of a monastic church, and the point to which we first want to draw attention is the vaulted roof. In figure 7, the plain barrel vaulting which was employed to cover the recesses at each side of the fireplace is particularly mentioned, and this was said to be like an ordinary railway tunnel. Now the vault to this aisle, which is illustrated, shows the next development, and it is a very important one indeed. There is the same barrel vault or railway tunnel along the aisle, but crossing it at right angles are other barrel vaults, following the lines of the arches into the nave, and between each intersection so formed is a semicircular arch. At the actual line of the intersection of the two semicircular barrel vaults, an angle was formed, which was called the groin. Each bay of the vaulting between the semicircular arches was a square, and the line of the groin, if you were making a plan, would run diagonally across it. The first thing the old builders found out was that the actual elevation of the groin was that of an ellipse, or wagon-shaped, and this must be so, because the groin springs, or starts from the same line, and only rises to the same height at the arches, crossing the aisle, which is semicircular, and as it spans is wider, because it goes across the diagonal of the bay, it must be of a flatter shape. Now as to the way these early vaults were constructed, the semicircular arches across the aisle were built first, then rough wooden centres or moulds of the shapes of the diagonal or groin were put up, boards were laid on the top, and the vault was constructed in what is called rubble, only rough stones, not shaped as to the arches, when they are called fusors. When this was set, the centring was taken down, and the vault was plastered on its underside. The first thing the old builders discovered was that the vault, by reason of the shape of the groins being flatter than semicircles, looked rather dumpy. Next, that the centre or crown of the vault was too flat, and the stones were inclined to fall out, and this applied as well to the groins themselves. So the next step was to make the profile or true elevation of the groin semicircular, but this raised the crown of the vault considerably above the tops of the semicircular arches crossing the aisle, and so to remedy this, these latter were taken up straight for the necessary distances to get over this, and then made semicircular as before. This was called stilting, but here again another difficulty was encountered. The now semicircular groins and the stilted crossing arches all sprung or started from the same level, but the groins at once started curving away, because they were true semicircles, whereas the stilted arches went up straight for a foot or so. This was found to be ugly, because it made the crossing arches look as if they had been pushed in at the bottom, between the two groins, and a good example of this is to be seen in the chancel of Hemel Hempstead Church, Hertfordshire. We give an illustration of this, figure 79, in volume 4. The next step was to spring all from the same level edges across the aisle pointed, and if you think this was the true solution of the difficulty, but it took a long time, and when it was done, the 13th century had arrived. The groin lines, too, were strengthened by the addition of stone ribs. Another surprise for the Norman builders was the discovery that by crossing their vaults as described, they concentrated the thrust at particular points, and it became necessary to make their buttresses outside of more projection. The drawing shows the cushion-shaped capitals to the columns and other details which are characteristic of Norman work. This may seem a rather long and tedious explanation, but it is very necessary to understand the development of vaulting if we are really to follow the growth of Gothic architecture. Another point to be remembered is that when Henry II came to the throne in 1154, it not only brought to an end the disastrous anarchy of the days of Stephen and Maud, but made England once more part of a great power. From 43 to, say, AD 410, we were part of an empire that stretched across Europe from Babylon to Britain. At the end of the 12th century, Henry II ruled all the land from the Pyrenees up through the western part of France, and Scotland, Ireland and Wales were his vassals. Where the king's law ran, an Englishman was free to go, and going came back with new ideas and a fresh outlook on life. This is reflected in the everyday things. Take Hedingham, the subject of figures 4 to 7, built in 1130, and you have a typical Norman keep, but with Orford, built by Henry II and finished in 1167, you have something which is much the same and yet quite different. Today the river Ald rises in the inward parts of Suffolk, and being joined by various tributaries, by the time it has arrived at Snape, at a quite presentable stream, and so it goes towards the sea at Aldborough, where perhaps only 200 or 300 yards from its destination it changes its mind, direction and name, and flows due south, parallel with the sea, and divided from Keeper's Lodge at the entrance, and then the passageway is contained along to the west turret, where the priest's chamber, complete with guardrobe and wardrobe, was placed. The main staircase continues up to the battlements, where one of the turrets was used as a bakehouse, and the ovens are still there, and in the other was a guard room for the sentries, keeping a lookout for hostile craft who might be thinking of raiding the port of Orford below. If by any chance you are not interested in architecture, can't spare a thought for the great king who reigned over Western Europe, and if you don't care very much about his castle and his architect, then you will reap a reward when you reach the battlements, which you will not deserve, in one of the most beautiful views in Suffolk, from the battlements across the marshes to the sea beyond. Before we leave Orford, two things must be noted. First, that the keep was originally the centre of an elaborate scheme of curtain walls, which have now disappeared. Secondly, that the keep is more completely a house under one roof than anything which followed it for many years. Leaving buildings, we can turn to the details of country life in the 12th century. Here we shall find that the Domesday Survey is valuable, because not only does it give us an idea of how much land was cultivated and how many people there were in England in 1085, but it also tells us what they were doing. The commissioners set themselves to find out the name of the manor, who held it at the time of King Edward the Confessor, and who held it now, how many hides there were in each manor, how many ploughs on the domain, how many men, how many villains, how many cotters, how many bondsmen, how many freemen, how many sockmen, or freemen paying fixed rent, how much wood, how much meadow, how much pasture, what mills, what fish ponds, how much it was worth, and whether more could be got out of it than now. An entry in Domesday Book reads something like this: The land of William of Brays. The land is of 3 ploughs. The whole extent of arable is 3 ploughlands, though it was only assessed as 2 hides. There is 1 in the domain. William manages 1 ploughland himself, and 5 villains and cutters with 2 ploughs. There are 2 teams in the domain. There is a mill of 18 shillings worth, and a fishery of 50 pence worth. And so England was parcelled out for the conqueror to estimate the value of his spoil. Okay, we're going to leave it there, and we will find out more about land holding in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed that. This has been Kate at the Library of Whisper saying